From KPFK Pacifica Radio, this is Rising Up with Sonali, and I'm your host, Sonali Kolhatkar. You can watch this program on Free Speech TV and listen to it on Pacifica radio stations and affiliates nationwide. We tend to think of literature as part of art, reflecting on history rather than making it. But a new book called The Written World explores in great detail how literature and writing have actually themselves shaped world history. As the technology to put words down on paper and in print have evolved, so has the impact of the written word on our political landscape, from writing, printing, mass publication, and digital storytelling. Martin Puchner is the Byron and Anita Wien Professor of Drama and of English and Comparative Literature at Harvard University, and he now joins me to discuss his new book, The Written World: The Power of Stories to Shape People, History, and Civilization. He's also written the best-selling 6-volume Norton Anthology of World Literature, among other works. Welcome to the program, Martin.
Thanks for having me, Sonali.
Thanks so much for joining us. So when we think about how information has passed down from generation to generation in human history, the advent of writing down words and history should really represent a very important turning point, right? So tell us about that turning point and how important it was when humans started writing things down as opposed to verbally telling them to one another.
It was a huge moment, Sonali, and it's a little difficult to reconstruct exactly how it happened because all of our knowledge really depends on the written record. So it's hard to even imagine how humans lived before. But there's a story told by Mesopotamian scribes in what today is Iraq about the origin of writing. This story itself is about 4,000 years old. And they imagined a king trying to subdue a rival king. And the king sends a messenger to the rival king and tries to threaten the rival, taunt him, bribe him, but nothing works. And then the king gets so angry that he goes on this long rant, and the messenger panics because he can't remember it all. And it's at this point in the story that this king takes some clay and puts his words on clay and gives the messenger the clay tablet and sends the messenger to the rival. And the rival king is so impressed by this new technology of writing that he immediately submits. So this is sort of an old story about the origin of writing, and it just shows how powerful this technology was seen from the very beginning.
Was writing simply a way, initially, as far as you know, a way to remember things that were too long to be remembered? I mean, you write in your book about the history in India of how priests would, repeat Hindu chants over and over in order to remember them. So did writing just become a sort of practical way to not forget?
Yes, writing had very practical origins. In fact, in Mesopotamia, where the first writing systems were developed, it was initially used for accounting purposes, really, to write down economic transactions, to keep records by a state, for tax collection. It was really a bureaucratic technology, if you will, giving rise to the first states. So very mundane, very practical. And it was only after some time that one of these scribes charged with keeping records used writing for a completely different purpose, and that was to write down a story. And as you just said, there were storytelling happens wherever humans lived. So there were these long oral storytelling traditions. But at this moment, when a scribe used this new accounting technique of writing to write down a story, something really important happens, namely the intersection of storytelling and writing technology. And that's, for me, the big bang of literature. This is really when literature as we know it, namely written stories, takes off.
Right. It's not that literature didn't exist before, but oral traditions are different from the written word because in the telling of a story, because we are human and because we are flawed, things change. As anybody knows, eyewitness reports are notoriously unreliable. In the telling of its stories change. But when you write something down, it is concrete and it's often, it's unchangeable. And of course, you leave a legacy for future generations to find. And so we know so much more about what happened in our world after the advent of writing than before, right?
That is so true, and we have to be, in fact, a little careful not to dismiss oral literature
Okay.
as insignificant, because you mentioned the case of India, where there were very elaborate oral traditions and divisions of labor, where certain people would remember certain parts of the Vedas, for example, and other people other parts. So they were very rich oral storytelling tradition, and they continue to live side by side with writing. But yes, writing as a technology, once it's used to write down stories, allows people to project written stories to far afield, to different parts of the world, and somehow miraculously to speak to the future, to imagine that they were addressing readers in the distant future, and as readers, imagining that they were communicating by reading old texts with people from the distant past. So it really changed the relationship to time, imagining this dialogue between the past and the future and between very remote parts of the world.
Was there resistance to this new technology? Whenever we have new technology, of course, there is hemming and hawing from all sectors about how it will change things. And we have that same conversation today about how the internet is changing reading and writing and communication. So when writing as a technology emerged, were the old school folks who relied on oral traditions resisting it?
That's exactly right. And I wrote this book very much before the background of this experience we all share, namely that we are going through this extraordinary revolution in writing technologies where how we communicate changes profoundly. And so one motivation for the book was to look at these earlier moments, what happens at earlier moments of technological transformation. And so there was resistance. There were people who were worrying about writing. I have a chapter on some of these charismatic teachers like the Buddha, like Confucius or Socrates or Jesus, who lived in literate cultures, who could have written, but who deliberately chose not to and insist instead on live interactive teaching with their students. So of those figures, Socrates was the most explicit about his worries about writing. He worried that you can't ask a text follow-up questions. You can't ask for clarification. It's very easy to take a text out of context and do something else with it. So he worried that there's huge room for misunderstanding and miscommunication. And he also worried that once we trust this external storage device of speech, we would no longer have to know things ourselves. So that was one example of an early worry about writing, and there were many similar worries. So yes, technological change, especially new powerful technologies that change the way we communicate, always go hand in hand with people worrying about those effects.
Right. And so the advent of the written word also enabled stories to be passed across the globe, across these vast geographical expanses that hadn't been imagined yet. When that you could actually convey information without having to speak face to face with somebody was a pretty remarkable thing. So not only did the act of writing stories become this great technological wonder, the influence of stories far beyond their initial reach were also very important impact to world history. You say, and you write in your book about Alexander the Great and the impact that the written word had on him. And of course, his impact on history is huge. So tell us that story.
It is huge. And of course, everyone knows that he was this incredible conqueror who conquered parts of Persia and all the way to northern India. But what really struck me is that the motivation for this conquest of parts of Asia was a text, namely the Iliad by Homer, a text, the Greek epic that he had grown up with and that describes a much earlier excursion of a Greek army into Asia Minor, what's now on the Turkish coast, to Troy. And when Alexander starts his conquest of Asia, he starts at Troy and he takes his copy of the Iliad with him and he sleeps on it every night. And he imagines that he is reenacting that older story. So that's, of course, one way in which literature shapes history, by shaping the minds of people who then go out and act and change history.
And of course, not always for the best, but that is how all technologies are, right? There is a good side and a bad side of all technologies, as we are again seeing with the revolution that the internet has brought today. And so going back to the written word as a technology that has a dark side, that you were saying Socrates had these concerns about, that were quite valid concerns. What were the upsides of the written word and that technology? What were the ways in which learning about one another through the literature that cultures produced actually resulted in progress for humanity?
I think it did, Sonali, because it allowed for an accumulation of knowledge. And the place where this happens is in these wonderful ancient libraries, like the Library of Alexandria or the Library of Pergamon in what's today southern Turkey, so that you can pass knowledge down to the next generation and gather knowledge from distant parts of the world. It really supercharges cultural evolution, where humans were able to accumulate knowledge and experience and process that and make that part of what it is to be human. And that's, of course, a very powerful technology that ultimately leads to science and to history and all other, really most other forms of knowledge. And that's an impressive achievement of the written world that we need to honor, I think.
What about converting oral traditions and literature into writing? We've heard, many of us have heard of course, the 1001 Arabian Nights, this very, very sort of famous collection of short stories from the ancient Arab world that has delighted people for generations. What was that an example of in the history of writing technology?
We all grew up with the Arabian Nights because they really conquered the world and were retold by Disney and many other in many media. The story about the Arabian Nights is interesting because it shows the emergence of a more popular form of literature, quite different from the early epic texts like the Homeric epics, also very different from early foundational religious texts that I talk about, but much more entertaining, much lighter, also bawdier in some ways. And the driver of that change, the way in which these kinds of stories made it into writing, again had to do with a revolution in writing technologies, in this case paper. Paper was originally invented in China and then made it into the Arabic world. Baghdad became a center for paper making. And the great thing about paper was that it really lowered the cost of literature, and that allowed more readers and writers to be connected to literature and to writing. And that led to an explosion of popular storytelling that was written down. And the Arabian Nights is really a collection of stories. The stories themselves come from all over the place, including India and Greece and the Arabic world itself. But the amazing thing is that these stories that would have been told orally initially were now written down and collected, and we're able to reshape literature.
I want to get to religious texts and their significance, but in a minute. One of the things that strikes me when we talk about the advent of popular literature is that in order to, of course, consume that literature, one needs mass literacy. And with mass literacy comes mass awareness and learning and education. How did the popularization of writing technology and then the consuming of that on a mass scale increase the sort of political awareness that human beings had about other cultures, about their rights, about what they might want or expect from their leaders? I know that's a huge question, but it's such a fascinating one.
It is, and it's a story that proceeds in fits and starts. And education is crucial, as you say. What I was struck by was there these early texts from scribal schools, again from like 4,000 years ago, and they sound so modern because you have students complaining about their strict teachers who beat them, who are mean to them. And you have stories of teachers who complain about students, saying that students used to be much better, but now this younger generation is no good. And so you
So
realize
echoing
that,
so many conversations we hear today.
exactly. And you realize that this schooling in literature and reading and writing has been in some sense the same for the last 4,000 years. The big difference is, as you mentioned, is that more and more people have been able to participate in it. And that's, I think, partially driven by technologies that lower the cost of literature and that start a kind of virtuous cycle where as the costs become lower, as literacy becomes easier. For example, with the invention of the alphabet, that makes it much easier to learn how to read and write. More people gain access to it, and that means that they are now demanding to be heard, that they want a voice in the conversation. So I do see, broadly speaking, a democratization of literature. Initially, for a long time in the ancient world, literature is really a very small and very elite phenomenon. But step by step, it becomes democratized, and then that changes the way people think about literature and who has access to it and whose story gets to be told. And this, I think, goes all the way to our own moment. And there are a lot of people who worry about the effects of the internet and our own writing and reading revolution. And I share some of these worries. But ultimately, I think I'm an optimist here because I see that today more is being written and read than ever before. And more importantly, more people have access to writing and reading. More people can publish. More people can raise their voice in writing than ever before. And that just has to be a very good thing.
Let's talk about religious texts. There are whole courses taught about the interpretation of ancient religious texts and what they mean for, the mindset or the ideology of large communities of people. There are debates that rage. And so how did the technology of writing change religion, change the way in which religion can sort of capture the allegiance of people, because now you can put a religious ideology down on paper and pass it around far and wide?
It had a huge effect, and the first thing to be said about it perhaps is that today, of course, we live in a world in which when we think of religion, we almost automatically think of sacred texts. That's not only true of the so-called religions of the book, namely Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, but also of Hinduism, of Buddhism. Really, almost all religions today, almost all world religions, are religions based on sacred texts. But like all things, this idea of a sacred text had to be invented. A little moment ago, we talked about the very mundane sort of accounting origins of writing. And so before that background, you realize that it actually was kind of surprising that this accounting technology would suddenly play such a large role in religion. For me, the origin of that, of the idea of sacred text, is the moment when Ezra returns with a group of exiled Jews from Babylonian exile to Jerusalem to reclaim the city and reinstitute Judaism as a temple practice in that city. But he doesn't just return to rebuild the temple. He brings something with him from Babylonian exile, the center of literacy at the time, and that is these written texts. And what he does upon his return to Jerusalem is he builds a stage and he takes these scrolls and he holds them up and he demands that the people pledge allegiance to these scrolls and that they worship them as if they were a god. And that for me is sort of the first time that a text was really being worshipped like an idol or a god. And so from that moment on, this idea of sacred scripture, that some writings would be seen as divine, takes hold and over time really affects most religions we have today.
Do you feel that that the written word then fostered inadvertently religious fundamentalism?
So you said earlier that writing is so powerful. That doesn't mean that all the effects were good. And I totally agree with that.
My guest is Martin Puchner. He is the Byron and Anita Wien Professor of Drama and of English and Comparative Literature at Harvard University. He's written the best-selling 6-volume Norton Anthology of World Literature, among other works. We've been discussing his new book, The Written World, The Power of Stories to Shape People, History, and Civilization. We're going to keep Martin on for an extended conversation, which you can find in the premium content section of our website at risingupwithsonali.com. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. You can also find out more about our program on Facebook, Twitter, iTunes, and Vimeo.